Welcome rad people one and all to this week's sermon, which is a continuation on my treatment of the explosive weapons of the Fallout series. This time we'll be looking mostly at thrown grenade type weapons, but there's some extras in here as well. While most people see explosives as just a combat aid, especially with the new Fallouts, explosives have a long and interesting history in the Fallout franchise. So crank up the rads and pop that pin, as things will be getting dicey in here. Frag grenades are the prototypical grenade that nearly everyone thinks of when they hear the word grenade, or otherwise think of a hand-thrown explosive. It is absolutely no surprise then that frag grenades are a common weapon in the Fallout games, and they can be found in every single Fallout game in the franchise. That's a lot of games. The frag grenade in the first Fallout sits comfortably between the weaker Molotov and the more powerful plasma grenade. Although they would logically be more rare than Molotovs, it would make sense that they would be more common than plasma grenades, but frags are actually surprisingly uncommon. Looking at the design, the overall shape of the grenade is the closest to a Mark 26 US Army grenade. The design on the Fallout grenade is unique, and I wasn't able to find anything that matched exactly. It looks and operates exactly the same in Fallout 2, and is best used against groups of enemies, but also in the early to mid-game. Endgame enemies like super mutants in the first Fallout or power-armored Enclave soldiers in Fallout 2 have pretty high resistance to explosives, and the amount of damage that the frag grenade dishes out just doesn't cut it, even when specializing in explosives. The in-game description mentions that it explodes on contact, which is a unique attribute since most frag grenades have a delay timer. I would also reckon that this kind of trigger would be a lot more dangerous for whoever wants to use such a weapon. But I think this part of the description is actually referring to the in-game mechanics, since the grenades appear to explode when they hit the ground, rather than hit and bounce around. Fallout Tactics has a slightly different looking frag grenade, but its damage is the same from the early games, placing it solidly in the middle of the pack of all available options. The design is different though. It has an actual historical design of the US Mark II hand grenade that saw its most extensive use in World War II. They are a lot more common in tactics though, and can actually be quite useful in clearing enemies from behind partial cover or trenches. Although the AP cost is relatively high, it has an ammo property that makes it effective against all targets. I only recently found out how useful grenades can be for clearing positions that the playable characters armed with guns otherwise can't hit, and grenades seem very well suited to the mechanics of tactics, especially when compared to Fallout and Fallout 2. The genre-defining game Fallout Brotherhood of Steel has the frag grenade as well, and I love the description that mentions that it is a military issue weapon, as opposed to like the generic super duper mart brand of grenades, I guess. It does a heap of damage. It is definitely one of the more powerful weapons and can often be found on the bodies of enemies. The design seems to take cues from the M26 Fragmentation Grenade that went into service in 1952 and is the most modern design we have seen yet. Van Buren, the cancelled would-be Fallout 3, was meant to have frag grenades, and their model looks the closest, though not exact, to a World War II era British grenade referred to as a Mills bomb, although it is not quite so round. There are no grenades in the Van Buren tech demo, but its data can be found in the game files. Fallout 3's frag grenade is a very common option for those brave enough to do an explosives build, and is also heavily preferred by super mutants and raiders. The frag grenade is fairly common and in the early game can absolutely wreck you, although it is outclassed by the likes of the plasma and nuke grenades, which are the only other two non-specialized options. The grenades no longer detonate on impact. They will bounce a few times before detonating and do extra damage to limbs, so being anywhere in the area of effect can be an absolutely crippling experience. Fallout 3's frag grenade is pretty peculiar looking and doesn't seem to resemble any real-world grenade all that closely. It slightly resembles the M26 grenade, although it is more angular and has the textured metal right in the middle that was a popular choice for earlier frag grenade designs. Interestingly, these ridges were meant to help the metal fragment more readily, but it didn't really have the intended effect. It did, however, help improve one's grip, which may be why the Fallout 3 grenade has it right in the middle. While frags will be less effective in the late game, reverse pickpocketing them onto any enemy will result in an insta-kill. And yeah, I guess a grenade blowing up in your pants will leave a mark, but reverse pickpocketing makes the frag grenade's lethality skyrocket. Also, now that weapons have degradation, Frag grenades can be found with low condition, and this will make the grenades do a bit less damage, and you can even repair frag grenades with other grenades just like normal weapons. What would that even look like? How do you use one grenade to fix another without blowing yourself up to bits? Even more interesting, a grenade with no condition left, aka a broken one, cannot be thrown, and yeah, that makes sense, but if you use it to reverse pickpocket instead, it will detonate like normal. In Fallout 3 now, all throwable explosives can be targeted in vats, and the frags can be shot and blow up at any time, even when just being held in someone's hand. There is an exception for grenades that are loose in the world, and shooting those will never make them detonate. They'll just go flying and bounce around. I do like to think that the ability to shoot frag grenades that are held by enemies is an unintended and organic way to replicate critical failures from earlier Fallout games, where a character or NPC's weapon could backfire in spectacular fashion. There is one variant in Fallout 3, which is the sim version from the Operation Anchorage DLC, that does not lose condition and is otherwise identical. Fallout 3 is also the first time we see something called grenade bouquets, traps that involve a tripwire or pressure plate that releases a bundle of 3 or so grenades that fall to the ground and detonate. These things can be really nasty. The number of crippled limbs I have from these is just insane. Interestingly, shooting them won't make them detonate, but they will fall completely armed and detonate after a few seconds. Some fun things about frags in Fallout 3 are that although you can pull the pin and hold the grenade, there's no option to cook it because the character model holds down the lever. Super mutants can be heard referring to frags as potatoes, and the swamp people in Point Lookout will refer to them as pineapples. And that does make sense because the checkered pattern does kind of resemble a pineapple, and the Mark II grenades in World War II were often called pineapple grenades by soldiers. In New Vegas, the frag grenade looks exactly the same but does more damage and is a pretty easy find with merchants. There are a number of grenade bouquets that can be encountered as well, although the number of grenade traps in New Vegas is far fewer than in Fallout 3. With a high enough explosive skill in both Fallout 3 and New Vegas, one can harvest 3 grenades from the bouquets, so they can become good sources of nades. Due to this small size, it can be a holdout weapon as well, so with sufficient sneak skill, they can be snuck into the casinos. There is one unique variant of the frag grenade, and it's not the Holy Frag Grenade, I covered that in another video, but the so-called Misfits Frag Grenade, or Training Grenade. They are not obtainable by the player and can only be used by Squad CG-5442, otherwise known as the Misfits. They will use the grenades only during the quest Flags of Our Foul-Ups, where the courier is helping the squad get their crap together by teaching them to hone combat skills, one of which is throwing grenades. Although they look and operate the same as regular frag grenades, they don't do any damage, although they do have a blast radius that will send objects flying. The concept art for the grenade used in Fallout 3 and New Vegas shows a grenade with rectangular ridges, but then on either end are these big springs that would have caused the grenade to bounce several times before detonating. I am glad we have regular frag grenades in game, because they can already be a pain to get on target sometimes, but something like this kinda would have been fun to mess around with. Fallout 4's redesign of the frag grenade makes it look pretty generic, and is fairly similar to the Mark II hand grenades that were used by the US during World War II, but also in later conflicts like the Korean War, and even some in Vietnam. Although there are some small differences, the similarities are apparent, and the fuse follows a post-World War II design. Frags are commonly used by enemies and can be found in traps where they are once again suspended by a string until a wire is tripped. They can be crafted and require adhesive, aluminum, fertilizer, oil, and a spring. And while all craftable explosives require adhesive, oil, and a spring, I find the choice of using aluminum very puzzling. Aluminum is a relatively soft and very light metal, so the fragments that are created when the grenade detonates would lose velocity really quickly, reducing the grenade's effectiveness and range. Getting footage for this, I had a lot of fun throwing frag grenades at cars because they would push or flip the cars around since cars are just so janky in Fallout 4. Whee! Frags do more damage in Fallout 4 than in either 3 or New Vegas, and Nuka World introduced 2 new frag grenade types. One is called the Smart Fragmentation Grenade and does a bunch more damage over the standard frag grenade, but also has a very strange ability. It is incapable of injuring the user somehow. So if you throw one at your feet and it explodes, you won't be harmed. While that is really cool because you can't accidentally get yourself all blowed up, we are left to wonder how in Adam's name could this even work. It has some small cylinders on the bottom and wires that are wrapped around the top and bottom half of the grenade, and it would have to have a way to sense the user and then redirect the fragments away from the user. Some sort of shaped charge that can adjust itself right before detonation could do the trick, I suppose. Another wild variant introduced with Nuka World is the so-called Fragmentation Grenade, MIRV, or MIRV. It looks the same except it has those cylindrical features we already saw all over the shell of the grenade, and the MIRV variant has the effect of basically becoming a cluster bomb. When the grenade detonates, shortly after 3 more frag-sized explosions will occur in the target area. One would think that this is the result of those tiny little cylinders, but there are way more than 3 of those on the grenades, and there's only 3 explosions. They also show up in Fallout 76 where they do similar damage and have the same effect. I would just like to add that the acronym MIRV has been used in Fallout a few times, but it seems even more ridiculous here than in other uses like with the Fat Man. Explained very simply, MIRV stands for Multiple Independent Re-Entry Vehicles, referring to a space or high atmosphere payload, usually a nuclear missile, that has multiple nuclear bombs that independently re-enter the atmosphere and come down on a target. The basic idea is that you are more likely to get the target if you have multiple bombs. It doesn't really apply to a Fat Man launcher, but it really doesn't apply or make sense in the context of a frag grenade. It honestly would make more sense to call it a cluster frag or something. The frag grenades in Fallout 76 look just like the ones in Fallout 4 and even do the same amount of damage, and having identical damage is not exactly common for weapons between the 2 games. It's not a rare weapon, and it can be crafted using the same exact materials as in Fallout 4. One little tip though, equipping armor with the assassin effect will cause you to take less damage from your own grenades because the perk blocks extra damage from humans, and guess what? You're a human! Pretty sure. Like, 97% sure. Hallucigen was a wildly unethical company that had a large corporate and testing building in what is left of Boston in Fallout 4. They had been engaged in chemical-based weapons and deterrence, with one of the chemical agents they had created being unintentionally released by a team of gunners that were there on a mission to retrieve certain items. This gas that has killed many and frenzied the rest of the gunners can be harnessed in a player-made grenade known as the Hallucigen Gas Grenade. Since it isn't found anywhere and has to be crafted, it is very rare and requires adhesive, aluminum, a spring, and a hallucigen gas canister where it can be created at a chemistry station. The grenade ends up looking exactly like the hallucigen gas canister, so it would seem like the sole survivor just modifies the existing canister to save on materials and work, which would be really smart. But no, the sole survivor makes an identical copy of the canister, just way smaller, so that it is a normal grenade size. It does no direct damage, rather the green gas is released and has a frenzy effect on targets, causing enemies to suddenly start attacking each other. Be careful though, some enemy types cannot be affected by the grenades, typically those that are higher level, and the game informs us that they are too powerful for this effect. I find that interesting, but not that surprising that a gas doesn't have a universal effect on everyone and everything. Fallout 76 has the same exact canisters and ability to make grenades, and it is built using the same exact materials in the same way. Targets will frenzy for 60 seconds, which is a decent amount of time, but they don't always benefit from explosive or grenade-focused perks like the Ordnance Express perk. It's interesting to think why we can find so many hallucigen canisters throughout Appalachia, especially as it is implied that the gas was still under development and hadn't been finalized. Many Fallout games, mostly the non-Bethesda Fallouts, feature plastic explosives, demolition charges, or C4. Why the East Coast seems completely bereft of such explosives, but seeing as I don't tend to use this explosive all that often, I can't say that I have really missed it. Plastic explosives were introduced with the first Fallout, where it was described as a chunk of something called Cordex, which sounds like it is the Fallout equivalent of the real-world explosive known as Semtex. It is shown in-game as being a chunk of explosive with a detonator attached, complete with a light and radio antenna. Although there is an antenna, one is not able to remotely detonate it. It can only explode after a countdown on a timer. The closest comparable weapon in Fallout is Dynamite, and plastic explosives do a good deal more damage than Dynamite while also weighing less, so it's just all around the superior choice. It does have a wider blast radius than Dynamite, which can be useful, but it can also be a good way to blow yourself straight to atoms, so use it with caution. Plastic explosives are not commonly found. Shops rarely carry them, and generally higher level areas and military installations are the only locations where they can be found, like the West Tech facility in the Glow and the Mariposa military base. Explosives are also useful for some types of doors, particularly wooden ones, because they can be blown up to allow access. This is actually something that should absolutely be a thing in the newer games, especially when the door is this flimsy, half-destroyed wooden thing. Plastic explosives are exactly the same in Fallout 2, it is still powerful and rare, although interestingly, one can be found super early on in the famously loved tutorial known as the Temple of Trials, but it has to be used then and there to break a stone wall in order to finish the tutorial. I just find it funny to contrast this very rare weapon with all the other low-tech stuff the villagers use at Arroyo. In both games, as soon as you arm this, you need to go back into your inventory and select drop. Otherwise, it'll just stick on your character and count down until you blow yourself up. And I know I'm not the only one that did that though, right, guys? Fallout Tactics has its own plastique. It looks more professional but works differently from the two games. It is best used to make traps more deadly since it doesn't have a way to remotely detonate, but if an existing trap is sprung by an enemy, that can trigger it to detonate. The concept art clearly labels it as C4 and uses an analog clock over a digital display, which does seem a little bit more Fallout-y to me. Plastic explosives were also meant to feature in Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, and although there is concept art and the required data in the game, it is not accessible at all. Fallout New Vegas is the final game that has plastic explosives, and it is now officially called C4. I wonder what happened to all that old Cordex. The C4 is easily identifiable as plastic explosive, although it has some post-apocalyptic changes, like the duct tape holding the blocks together, and an impromptu handle as well. It makes sense when looking at it that the C4 model was based on the bottle cap mine model. The handle is a huge tell. This type of explosive appears to be designated M112 according to the labels on the outside, and the explosives include a tagant, which is a special physical or chemical additive that is used to be easily detectable and act as a marker so a forensic analysis could figure out where this explosive came from. The C4 is devastating, doing 250 damage, and finally, we get to remotely detonate the plastic explosive. Using the handy-dandy detonator, any and all bricks of C4 that were armed and placed will go off at the same time. It is considered an improved holdout weapon like the frag grenades and can be snuck into casinos with the right sneak skill. There are some really strange things about C4 though. It can be reverse pickpocketed into targets where it is armed and will blow up when the detonator is activated, and if this is done while hidden, NPCs will initially look around for you, and if they find you, they'll turn hostile. If you're able to wait several seconds while remaining undetected, they will finally give up, stop looking, and become non-hostile. Must have been the wind. Placing C4 on the ground around people won't cause them to turn hostile, but once the C4 is detonated in front of them and someone gets hurt or dies, they will attack. One caveat to this is that if an NPC is hit by the C4 as it is laid down, it will do one single point of damage, which is enough to make them hostile. Lastly, the C4 can be set off in other ways besides the detonator. One way is to have it close to another explosive, so laying this down next to a mine, for example, will cause it to go off when the mine does and make the explosion much more damaging. It can also be detonated by shooting at it, which does not happen in the real world. Plastic explosives are stable enough that shooting, burning, and in most circumstances, detonating explosives close by will not cause it to go off. They will only detonate when a blasting cap goes off that provides a shockwave of sufficient pressure, so C4 in-game really shouldn't be able to detonate when it is shot. Maybe a case could be made for energy weapons since we don't know the exact effects they would have, because I hate to break it to you guys, plasma rifles don't exist, just like birds. One important thing to note is that the health of the C4 blocks is quite low, and tossing a brick will cause 1 damage, So if you're trying to make a giant explosion by piling a bunch in one spot, try not to toss the bricks onto each other, or else kaboom. There's also a limit on the effective range of the detonator. When C4 is placed and the player goes too far, it may cause it to detonate, but the distance is pretty far, so this is kind of rare. C4 is easier to find than in earlier games. Many merchants can sell it, and many locations can have some, usually locked away in a locker or safe. We have a group of grenades that were introduced and only found in the Fallout 4 add-on, Nuka World, and let's start with the Fury Grenade. It looks exactly like the Hallucigen Gas Canisters, and these grenades can only be crafted after learning the recipe from Dixie, the atom-damned psycho from the Disciples. It requires all the same materials as the other grenades we mentioned. The interesting ingredients, though, are dirty water, an antifreeze bottle, and fever blossom. The bluish-green with purple coloring of the blossom seems to give the Fury Grenade gas its color, but its effects when eaten versus when turned into a gas are markedly different. Consuming a fever blossom doesn't have much of an effect, just adds 15 hit points in one rad, but mixing it with antifreeze seems to induce mania in people and creatures. It can be a great way to stealth kill NPCs, since throwing the grenade out in the open when detected by others won't make anyone aggro except for the person affected. All other NPCs will immediately turn on and usually kill the one under the influence of the grenade, and one will go on their merry way like it's a normal Tuesday, which at Nuka World it probably is. With how similar this is to the Hallucigen Gas Grenade, it makes me wonder if Fever Blossom was being researched at Hallucigen or if this is just some strange coincidence. The Persuasion Grenade is similar in that it uses a hallucinogen canister. It seems to have a white gas or liquid on the inside and has a super specific application. It will make humans more easily persuadable, but not all humans, and it only works during the Nuka World quests to take over the Commonwealth settlements. When attempting to take a settlement, a confrontation will occur where the residents of a settlement will have to be threatened to leave or attacked outright, and the Persuasion Grenade can lower the threshold for the speech checks to force the settlers to stand down. Throwing it will cause a white mist or smoke to erupt, and we are informed that they are easier to persuade now. This grenade, or really the substance inside of it, seems to have been engineered by one of the operators known as Lizzie, because Lizzie kept notes on her testing on a terminal at the parlor. She had been experimenting with her formula, using different test subjects that were provided to her, with the aim of turning them more willing to do whatever was asked of them. The first few test subjects were chem addicts who did not react well to the concoction. One of them immediately seized and died, and the other was basically tortured to death when it was administered intravenously. Lizzie started to get results when an old farmer was brought to her who was very susceptible to the gas. Although Lizzie still had to be persuasive, she was able to get the farmer to take off her own shoes, clothes, pickpocket a member of the Disciples, and then the most extreme test of all. She abused the poor farmer to put her into a state where she would want to run and escape at all costs, and then dosed her with the gas and gave her orders to go get some things from the market. And guess what? It worked. Although she could have easily have ran away at that point, she went to the market, got the things, and came back. Unfortunately, the farmer would eventually die because of the torture she endured before the test, but Lizzie would come to find through more test subjects that only farmers and those that lived on settlements seemed to be affected. She figured this out when she had sneakily dropped a canister next to a merchant at the market to see if it would have any effect. Traders with caravans were similarly unaffected, and it made Lizzie wonder, was it the hard labor settlers had to perform that made them more susceptible? Was it perhaps something in the water, or just something else in the environment? There is no definitive answer, but she was able to test the gas on an entire settlement of 9 people and watch as she was able to make them do whatever she wanted. A few of these grenades exist out in the world, including one dropped by Lizzie in the market as part of her testing, but the rest have to be crafted. The recipe is super simple. It requires the normal grenade materials like aluminum, a spring, and adhesive, but then just requires fever blossom, and that's it. Although the fact that the gas only works on settlers is more of an in-game mechanic, in order to make taking settlements easier, I would like to hear your in-game explanations that would explain why only settlers and farmers are affected. The pack has their own grenade that is different yet again, but I think this is one of my favorite of the three, although it can be really unpredictable and kind of frustrating. It doesn't look anything like a grenade because it uses a souvenir teddy bear that looks like it came from a Tim Burton movie as the base. It has an electronic emitter of some sort strapped to the middle and a grenade pin in the head that appears to activate the emitter and make the bear blow up in a low-grade explosion of blood and gore. The grenade is unique in that once it activates, a wasteland predator will come bounding in shortly after, gunning for the emitter and whatever else is in its way. It's pretty janky and can have some really funny results, but it's unique, and I like that. It doesn't spawn in any creatures when it's used, so if there are no predators nearby, you'll just get a notification that nothing is close, so it will have no effect. Additionally, it seems to have some sort of cooldown, where after a successful bait, throwing another one can result in a notification that you can't lure additional predators at this time. It seems to work by attracting predators using audio or perhaps an electromagnetic wave from the emitter, as well as the smell from the meat. 3 predator grenades will be given to the players by Mason, the leader of the pack, during the Home Sweet Home quest, as well as the recipe to craft them. This is the most involved of all the grenades, requiring the normal parts of the other ones, as well as a cave cricket gland, rad rat meat, and fever blossom. The fever blossom is likely what makes the predator frenzy, and I'm guessing the cricket gland and rad rat meat act as extra sensory attraction for the predator, along with the emitter. Next up are flash grenades, and warning to those sensitive to sudden flashes on the screen, this section will have a lot of that, particularly near the end, so just skip this section if you need to. The first time we see a flash grenade in the series is in Fallout Tactics, and although it does do a bit of damage, the real selling point is that it is meant to have a stun effect on enemies. The only problem is this stun effect doesn't last for very long, meaning that you need to throw more stun grenades to achieve the effect you want, but flash grenades are not a common grenade type to come across. It doesn't resemble any flashbangs I could find. Most often flashbangs are rather skinny and tall, and the Tactics version has a rounded bottom that would not allow the grenade to sit upright. Most puzzling of all is that the nuclear symbol is on the side, implying that this thing is radioactive or nuclear based. Most flashbangs work by having a metal, like aluminum or magnesium, rapidly oxidized by being exposed to another chemical. Using a radioactive element or nuclear process to achieve the same effect would be on brand for Fallout, but of course would be ridiculously dangerous, and that's why we love it. Van Buren would have had flash grenades much like how they were in Tactics, being useful in situations where collateral damage needed to be kept at a minimum. None of the East Coast games have flashbangs, or, well, technically one does, but I'll talk about that in a moment. New Vegas introduced flashbangs with the Lonesome Road DLC, where although they only deal low damage, they instead rely on dealing fatigue damage, much like some other niche weapons like the boxing gloves. Fatigue is a hidden value that every NPC has, much like a health bar, and when they take fatigue damage, it lowers their fatigue levels until they go unconscious. There are additional effects though. One of these effects lowers the target's weapon skill by 50 for 10 seconds, and the other is specific to the tunneler enemy type, where using one around them has a 25% chance to make them frenzy and fight each other. The flashbang model looks very similar to the Type 84 stun grenade in every way, just with a differently designed pin. Like many grenades, they are improved holdout weapons but are best used either against tunnelers or to support normal combat operations by applying debuffs to enemies. When they go off, there is a blue flash, and the air distorts in the area of effect, and the closer the player is to the flashbang, the effects on the player can go from just blurring vision to completely washing out the image. Flashbangs are not that common. They are only found in the Divide and used only by the Courier and Ulysses, who will use them against the player at the end of the DLC if he turns hostile. Flashbangs will readily cripple limbs if they land close to the target, and although they deal fatigue damage, I could never make a human NPC go unconscious. They usually just died before that happened. Tunnelers, on the other hand, would be knocked unconscious pretty easily. This could be the result of grenades benefiting from any explosive perks like splash damage, though. Flashbangs were actually going to be in the base game and were going to be called stun grenades, but were cut and made exclusive to the Lonesome Road DLC instead. The Wastelanders update to Fallout 76 had a flashbang in the game files, although it is not accessible in-game. It is exactly like the flashbang in New Vegas and would have operated similarly, blinding and deafening the player and staggering enemies. It also would have been craftable, needing adhesive, fertilizer, oil, and steel. Okay, this one really stretches the definition of explosives, but it is used like any other grenade. The powder bag in Fallout Tactics is, well, it's a bag with powder in it. The in-game description puts it best. It is a low-tech hunting weapon that is thrown at the face of the target. That seems more trouble than it's worth. Powder will puff through the cloth of the bag, leaving the creature blinded and stunned. So it seems like it's only effective if it's thrown at the face, although in-game there is no such distinction, and it does induce a short-term stun effect on targets similar to the flash grenade, but it is pretty short-lived. The one advantage this has over the flash grenade is that it is way more common, and it is used often by Beast Lords, a faction that is obsessed with creatures and can psychologically control many of them. Dynamite is another long-standing explosive that has been with us since the very first game, where it was always shown in a bundle of several sticks wrapped together with a timer. It does decent damage and is very common to find among merchants and in many locations, especially military sites and mining towns. It is used just like plastic explosive, where a timer is set and then it has to be dropped close to whatever you're trying to blow up. One interesting thing is that the player can have a critical failure when setting dynamite if they have low luck or explosive skill, and this results in the dynamite blowing up as soon as it is armed and placed. Interestingly, arming and dropping it near NPCs will cause some of them to turn hostile, but not all. It is also really hard to use in combat situations because of the timer being interrupted by the turn-based combat system. Dynamite shows up in exactly the same way with the same damage in Fallout 2, and it is just as plentiful and useful, being necessary to complete some side quests. Also, don't blow up the Brahmin, or the Fallout gods will crash your game. Dynamite was meant to show up in Van Buren and can be found in the tech demo files, but it's otherwise not accessible. Even though we don't know much about the Dynamite in Van Buren, the switch to being a single stick set the stage for the next time we see Dynamite. Skipping Fallout 3, New Vegas is the next time we see Dynamite, and we are given a number of different options. The normal vanilla Dynamite is a single stick with a wick, and its low strength requirements and lack of any explosive skill to use proficiently makes it a really good early game weapon for anyone, so long as you can time your attacks right. To use, the player lights up their Zippo lighter that they pull out of their vault pocket, which is very similar to the prison pocket by the way, and light the wick, which gives the stick approximately 3 seconds before it detonates. The Dynamite is an improved holdout weapon and is one of the more reasonably sized of the holdout weapons we have discussed. Hey baby, is that a stick of dynamite in your pants, or are you just happy to see Benny? One variant is the long fuse Dynamite, which is exactly the same except it has a longer fuse, big shock, and therefore it takes 6 seconds before blowing up. While a little less common than normal Dynamite, it can still be found in relative abundance, especially on the bodies of fallen powder gangers. New Vegas just couldn't help itself though and gave us the Time Bomb that looks very much like the Dynamite from the earlier games. There are 5 sticks all tied together with an egg timer that looks just like one I had growing up, which is set when the time bomb is deployed. You cannot change the time. It is always 15 seconds, and although it is 5 sticks of dynamite, it doesn't do 5 times the damage of the single stick of dynamite. It only does double the damage. There aren't a ton of places where this can be found, usually large areas like Camp McCarran, the Legion Safehouse, or Hoover Dam to name a few. Reverse pickpocketing it though will cause it to blow up at the same rate as grenades. You don't have to wait the full 15 seconds. There are some important things to know because this is distinct from every other late explosive. Since it isn't flat like mines are, it has the potential to start rolling downhill, which can be useful if that's your plan, but is a royal pain in the butt if you don't expect it to happen. Once it is laid, it cannot be disarmed like mines can, but it can be picked up and placed somewhere else if you're feeling brave. There is a unique variant with the Gunrunner's arsenal that is the high-yield version. It is almost 3 times more powerful, holy crap, and is a little more powerful than 5 normal sticks of dynamite. The high yield cannot be found anywhere in the game and only takes duct tape, dynamite, and scrap electronics. But it does require an explosives perk of 70 and the Mad Bomber perk, otherwise it cannot be crafted. The only difference between the high yield bomb and the normal one is 1 stick of dynamite. I love how adding 1 more stick of dynamite makes it high yield and suddenly do 3 times the same damage as the normal time bomb. There is one strange version of dynamite just referred to as no drop dynamite, whose only difference is that it cannot be dropped. Funny that. The most prolific users of dynamite are the Powder Gangers, a group of NCR prisoners who successfully rioted with the liberal use of violence and explosives like dynamite, and were able to take over the correctional facility they were being held at and call it their own. They had access to large quantities of dynamite because they were being used as labor to construct train tracks that would allow greater access to the eastern parts of the Republic like the Mojave. Dynamite in general works the same when reverse pickpocketing, and it can blow up when shot, which is not particularly common, especially with so-called inert dynamite, of which the dynamite in New Vegas is because it's right on the label. Inert doesn't mean that it doesn't work at all, rather that it is especially stable and less likely to detonate due to shock, like say from getting shot. Another notable detail on the outside is that there are 2 American flags, but they are the 50-star versions, which was not the official flag of the United States since 1969, when it was changed to a 13-star style. That means this dynamite is older than 1969, meaning it is at least 312 years old. Fallout 76 is the only East Coast game with dynamite, and it wasn't until the Wastelanders update that it was introduced. Dynamite is relatively rare and cannot be traded, dropped, or crafted until after the Wastelanders questline, where the plan can be bought from Mortimer for 100 gold bullion. That is some pricey dynamite. Once the plan is known though, it is super easy to craft, just taking 2 adhesive, fertilizer, and oil, at which point the resulting stick of dynamite does more damage and has a larger blast radius than even a frag grenade. Dynamite is very clearly superior to grenades for that reason alone. One thing I do love about Fallout 76 is that they are going back to the original games for so many designs, and so we get the Dynamite bundle, which looks not too dissimilar to the Time Bomb in New Vegas, or the Dynamite from the early games. With 5 sticks of dynamite and an egg timer, it will blow up in only 5 seconds, but these can be chucked at the same distance as a normal stick of dynamite, not just thrown down in front of you. For having 4 extra sticks, it only does 50 more damage than just a lone dynamite, and the crafting requirements are the exact same as the single dynamite stick, just in higher quantities. Also, I guess we're just pulling these egg timers out of thin air now. Fallout 76 gives us an odd grenade known as the Pumpkin Grenade, because, yeah, it actually does look like a pumpkin. This strange little grenade is only craftable after completing the Trick or Treat daily quest, which can also reward the player with 3 or more pumpkin grenades. These grenades are interesting. When they detonate, enemies will take increased damage for 5 seconds, they will lose 20 HP per second for 5 seconds, and they will be dosed with 40 rads for 5 seconds as well. All it takes to make are the usual suspects, but then radioactive pumpkin seeds, which are also rewarded with the Trick or Treat quest. This grenade really gives me some Green Goblin vibes. Pulse grenades have been with us since the very beginning in the very first Fallout, and have often stayed constant in their very specific use case until the later Fallouts. They have a contact fuse, so when they hit or get close to the target, they will detonate and unleash an intense electromagnetic pulse that will overload circuits and cause shorts by inducing electricity. This means that while they are useless against organic enemies, robots can take a pretty high amount of damage from them if they manage to land nearby. The design is unique and rather strange. It is very round and would be prone to rolling since it looks essentially like a baseball, with a notable green reflective circle on one part of the grenade that could be a button or a way to arm it, or it could be part of the sensor or contact fuse that is mentioned in the weapon description. When they detonate, we see arcing electricity on the ground right around the grenade. They are usually found in military installations or complexes that have robots or just generally more advanced technology, or a few weapon merchants like Jacob at the old hub town. While it is well known that these are made to absolutely wreck robots, what is less obvious is that they deal full damage to the master as well, since he has integrated himself with various computers and electronics. I find this implication so interesting because he is not just connected to the electronics, but his bodily functions are tied to them to the point that if they take damage, he takes damage. In Fallout 2, they are exactly the same, and the location with the highest number of pulse grenades is the Enclave oil rig. In tactics, pulse grenades are basically identical to the two previous games, which is interesting. They look the same, they have the same weapon description, and they do the same damage. There are not too many in the game, and there isn't much reason to use them until the very end game, when the warrior and their squad must fight through Vault 0, past all the high-level robots to the calculator. It is worth noting that unlike previous games, pulse grenades will now leave behind a little residual radiation, and while a nuclear process isn't required to generate EMPs, it's not that surprising that the Fallout world opted for a nuclear method. Unsurprisingly, Van Buren would have had the pulse grenade, but it would have been called an EMP grenade, and it would have looked radically different. The cancelled Fallout Extreme also would have had a pulse grenade had it been developed and released. Fallout 3 completely redesigned the pulse grenade, although it remains mostly lethal to robots and gun turrets, while dealing a tiny but overall negligible amount of damage to non-robotic enemies. The grenades look pretty neat and have a coil near the top, and I think this grenade does the best job of communicating that it does electrical damage just by looking at it when compared to any of the other grenades. The large blue electric shockwave will affect anything in range, dealing considerable damage to robots, and also causing them to shut down for several seconds, which can allow the player to get in some extra damage. Pulse grenades are not rare in the Capital Wasteland, they can be found pretty regularly and can be bought from a number of merchants, so it's generally not a big deal to use all or most of them in a robot-heavy area. Now I know I said they don't deal much damage to biological targets, but there is one way that they can insta-kill a human target, and you probably know how. Reverse pickpocketing strikes again, and dropping a pulse grenade into someone's inventory will cause them to be killed with a single pulse grenade. And there is even the added benefit of the explosive damage doing next to nothing to everyone else around the target. You know, if that's something you care about. Fallout New Vegas uses the same exact model as Fallout 3 and even does the same amount of damage, which is very unusual for weapons that are shared between the two games. One huge difference with pulse grenades in New Vegas, though, is that they can now affect power armor, something that they probably should have been able to do this entire time. They're not quite as common as in Fallout 3, but generally they aren't too hard to obtain. But interestingly, EMP weapons do less damage to robots when inside Big Mountain. Either something there causes a certain level of interference or absorption of EMPs, or all the robotics have been built to be extra robust against EMP weapons. Now, since they do extra damage to power armor, it is best to not be in power armor when using the pulse grenades because any collateral damage will be severe, and I think it's interesting to think about EMPs doing damage to the human inside of the suits. It would make sense that if the suit was shorting out and had large amounts of current flowing through it due to the EMPs, that the human inside would be electrocuted in the process, and that is most likely the damage that we are receiving. Fallout 4 redesigned the pulse grenade again, so already we have had 3 different designs, and this one is probably my least favorite of all of them. Although it is clear by looking at it that it's some sort of grenade, since there is a pin and tiny lever on the bottom. Bizarrely, pulse weapons now deal a solid 150 energy damage across the spectrum. They no longer do big damage to only robots and power armor, it's the same amount regardless of enemy type. This essentially just turns it into a different kind of grenade that has a different damage type, and honestly that change is kinda dumb. They are also quite rare, with only a couple static spawns and a few merchants that will sell them, but they are craftable, so that helps I suppose. They function basically as just a weaker and easier to get alternative to plasma grenades, since they have the same exact crafting materials list, but just need one less of a few things like aluminum, circuitry, and nuclear material. They also require only Demolition perk rank 3 and Science perk rank 2, where the Plasma needs 4 and 3 respectively. However, plasma grenades do double the damage of pulse grenades because they do 150 ballistic and 150 energy, not just the 150 energy damage. What is interesting is that there was meant to be an Institute EMP grenade that looked identical with some coloring differences, and it actually would have only done damage to robotic enemies while sparing the biological ones. I like to think that the Institute was stocking up on these while Gen 1 and 2 synths were being produced, like just in case, you know, those synths got some wild ideas and maybe some heavy German accents. Pulse grenades in Fallout 76 look like they do in Fallout 4, but now do 175 normal damage in addition to 175 electric damage, so enemies with electrical weaknesses will be affected even more. That said, they are not super common to find. and they're still not as potent as some of the other options, so I usually go for something like plasma grenades since inventory and carry weight is a premium in this game. A random little grenade, if we want to call it that, is not available to players in Fallout 76, but is found in the files and shows a radio or speaker with some tape that has D-Claw written on it. And we can only surmise that whatever sound or frequency this will emit will either attract a Deathclaw or be intolerable to one and cause a Deathclaw to run away. I actually quite like the MacGyver-esque design of this thing and hope to see it in the future in-game, especially if it's some recording of Deathclaw mating calls. So I covered nuke grenades in a previous video, but missed two other nuke-based grenades that should be mentioned. The Mini-Nuke Grenade comes from that little rascal Fallout Brotherhood of Steel, and this thing is an absolute monster. A tiny little nuke was crammed into a package that was small and light enough for a person to throw, and upon detonation, this thing does an astonishing 1,000 to 1,200 base damage, with a huge blast radius as well. It can make it really hard to get away from actually, insta-killing all but the most powerful of enemies, and even then, it does a heap of damage. Interestingly, it doesn't just do raw damage, it will also electrocute targets for 10 seconds after detonation, which is not an effect I expected. But this is Brotherhood of Steel after all, so I don't even know what I should expect. It is only found in the vault on level 3, so should be used sparingly, and has an insane value of 30,000 caps. It is hard to make out what this even looks like. It almost looks like it was made to resemble a small bomb, with a cone-shaped nose and some small fins on the back with glowing lines down the side. Part of me wonders, since this came out before Fallout 3, if this is what inspired the whole idea of mini-nukes, and their use with the new to Fallout 3 weapon, the Fat Man. If we have Brotherhood of Steel to thank for the iconic Fat Man, the irony would be palpable. There is an unusable nuclear grenade weapon in Fallout 76 that is now labeled as the lightweight mini-nuke, and it looks exactly like a nuke grenade. We can surmise that it was meant to pack the punch of a mini-nuke in a package that could be thrown by hand, but we don't know for sure. When it was first encountered on the test servers, it was called the Fission Grenade and it did no damage. After further updates, it had its name changed, but then was tied to a perk that is unobtainable, thereby blocking the grenade from players altogether. The final cut weapon here is one that was going to be in Fallout 3's Operation Anchorage DLC called the Signal Flare, but its in-game model looks exactly like a frag grenade. It can only be obtained with console commands and can be thrown, and you can track it as it flies through the air, but as soon as it hits a surface, it disappears and doesn't explode or anything because it lacks required scripting. This seems to have been an idea intended to have the player maybe mark a spot for attack, or possibly retrieval by a vertibird, but we can't know for sure. Let's end this list with a bang, or I guess in this case, more of a burn, but isn't an explosion just a really fast burn? What was I supposed to be talking about? Incendiary grenades are not nearly as common as one would think. They seem like one of the most basic grenade types in any sadist's toolbox. Fallout Tactics is actually the first game to feature one, where it is described as an anti-personnel grenade loaded with napalm. The model is actually an exact copy of the US M67 grenade, which famously did not have napalm in it, and incendiary grenades as a whole seem to be primarily used for the destruction of equipment, burning hot enough to melt metal and decommission vehicles and other hardware. At any rate, they are usually found at the beginning of the game where they are most effective against unarmored targets, but really struggle against heavy armor and especially robots. Robots just don't give a shit about fire. If you are going to have a grenadier on the team, use these up in the early levels rather than hang on to them. Fallout Brotherhood of Steel has incendiary grenades, and shockingly, their in-game model looks very similar to real-world incendiary grenades like the AN-M14. That makes it all the funnier that they tried to get the real-world model, which is not common for this game, and then decided to write the words "whoop ass" on the side like we are playing the weirdest version of Duke Nukem yet. It is only available in the late game, and is a rare item, but it is just as powerful as the frag grenade, with a large blast radius, and targets will burn for more damage for an extra 5 seconds, so it's pretty good. Fallout New Vegas had to show up here again, as they have incendiary grenades that are a pretty standard cylindrical shape like we would expect. The writing on the side lets us know that its official name is the AN-205M Incendiary Grenade Model 0531. Say that 10 times fast. And its combat utility is quite decent. It deals both explosive and fire damage, with the explosive damage less than half of a frag grenade, and the flame damage dealing 6 damage over 15 seconds, for a combined damage total of 140, which is a little higher than a standard frag. The explosion that is seen after it detonates is less like any sort of napalm bomb that sends flames flying all over. It looks almost thermobaric, with a large, quick orange cloud. These are yet again improved holdout weapons and can be found in a shockingly high number of locations, and can sometimes be sold by a handful of traders, even little old Chet over at Goodsprings. My favorite part about these though, is they tend to send killed enemies flying straight up into the air, and for that reason alone, are totally worth using over any other grenade type. Lastly, an Incendiary Grenade was intended to feature in Fallout 76, and maybe still can at some point, but since that game already has the Fire Floater Grenade, which would accomplish the same thing, I don't know if we will ever actually see it. That is it. If your favorite explosive didn't make the list, make sure to check the other explosive videos because it is probably there. But what is your favorite explosive to use? How many times have you actually done an explosives build? Admittedly, I have not done a dedicated explosives build, but if I had to, Fallout New Vegas would seem to be the best game for that. A huge thank you to Bobhead for helping me get footage and recording some of the Fallout 76 bits. A big thank you to my supporters on Patreon and YouTube. You guys make my rad world go round. And if you would like to support me, you can become a member or just let me know somehow that you like what I do. A very warm welcome to new supporters, Volt Word, Extreme, Anthony Pickens, and the Alt Vault. Also, I see you double dipping there. Thank you for joining. A big thank you to my Alta Adam supporters, Acrid B, Arctic Snowpup, Gardner Minshew Simp, Tessa Storm, Tiny Satan 999, Dummy Double, that's not a typo, Tapey Papey, the Alt Vault, and Juan Vader. Adam is pleased. Please everyone, take care of yourselves. We all have a place in Adam's plan. Watch out for others. Take comfort in Adam's crackly warmth, and I will see you soon.